My name is Catherine Augustine, and I'm the director of the RAND Corporation's Pittsburgh office. And I'm also a researcher, and I study kids. So specifically, I evaluate interventions aimed at reducing bullying, reducing othering, improving relationships among students and with adults. And throughout the course of my 20-year career, and over the past 2 days, my hope for these efforts has waxed and waned. It certainly waned yesterday morning as we heard statistics on hate crimes, hate-fueled violence, and I've had embers of hope, such as when I was observing the Youth Summit upstairs earlier today, and I think this panel will further those flames and perhaps give us all a bit of hope as we talk about not just the red flags we should be aware of, but what to do about them, more importantly. And so I'm joined by 3 esteemed panelists, and I am going to ask them questions one at a time, and then some follow-up questions, and introduce them as I pose the questions. And I'm going to start with Jacob Ware, who is on the far end there. And Jacob is a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he studies domestic terrorism and counterterrorism. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown. And he and a good friend and former colleague of mine, Bruce Hoffman, are co-authoring a book now in an attempt to outdo Jared Diamond. They have titled it God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, and that's coming out next year, so keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, let's move to talking about youth. So we've had a lot of panels up until this point talking about youth violence from various angles, and I want to start with an overarching question. So when we think about hate-fueled violence, are youth, Jacob, playing an outsized role in that violence, and has youth violence increased over time based on the metrics we have? And if the answer to either of those questions is yes, why is that so?
Sure, thank you so much, and thank you, Laura, for having me again. Before I jump in to talk about that, let me just send a very, very quick message of love and positivity and support to brothers and sisters in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. I don't know if there's any indications yet of the news there, whether it's hate motivated, but even as we meet here, there's another story of a community that's been devastated by violence. So all my thoughts are over there. So to answer your question, Catherine, yes, youth seems to be playing a larger role in radicalization, extremism, and terrorism. I think to answer your second question of why, the first kind of element of that is social media. I'm not going to harp on about the role of social media because we've had so many other panels on it, but my analysis is that social media has ultimately served to lower barriers to radicalization, both to ideology and also to violence, by really allowing people with very profound personal grievances, whatever they may be, to find easily accessible ideologies online and radical communities that allow them to answer for those grievances. My working group, which I can introduce in a minute, emerged out of the study of the incel movement. So I've been here before speaking about incels. That's a movement that has a very kind of connected online subculture that's based on extremely personal grievances like loneliness, sexual frustration. We also saw personal grievances play a role in the Islamic State's radicalization of young people across the Western world. So those are 2 movements right there that have really benefited from social media, benefited from their ability to speak to young people who, for whatever reason, are drifting through life, searching for community, searching for belonging. COVID accelerated that trend, coming along at a particularly devastating moment where you would have really an unprecedented number of young people spending an unprecedented amount of time online with little supervision, dealing with really, really difficult questions about the world, their safety, their place in it. And again, as we've seen, a lot of those individuals unfortunately found solace in online communities that were force-feeding them simplistic answers to those conversations, and most crucially, blaming an outgroup for their issues. This has had tactical impacts too, and that's the last thing I'll say on this question is, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing fewer explosive attacks, for example. And we're now seeing a particular kind of attack that involves lone actors targeting soft targets using firearms, is because of that lowered barrier to radicalization and violence, encouraging young people with less training, less experience, to go and commit those acts of violence and often do so very successfully. In this space, we've also seen, partly I think because of that, an overlap, especially with incels, with kind of non-ideological school shooters. Very often we see similar grievances, we see similar radicalization pathways, if you can call it that, and we see similar targeting. So definitely youth is playing a bigger role across the board, and it raises an important set of questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we heard on an earlier panel today some speculation that, at least for young men, they might be feeling disenfranchised due to recent movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And so other than trying to detect that sense of disenfranchisement, what should we be looking for as a red flag?
Sure, so I'm here at Eradicate Hate leading a working group on youth red flags. You heard very briefly from my brilliant co-chair, Julian Hunchak, yesterday. Let me start by briefly going into a bit more depth about what we're trying to do here, and then talk about some of those vulnerabilities. So I think our working group really has three priorities. One is to identify the red flags, the vulnerabilities, susceptibilities, warning signs. Two is to discuss those, identify them safely, responsibly, appropriately, and I can explain what I mean by that in a minute. And third is to pass those on to people, organizations taking non-carceral approaches. So we're not just creating a problem and trying to arrest our way out of this issue. So let me quickly lay out some of the vulnerabilities. And I have been, sat in this room, and I've been both encouraged and also discouraged by the fact that some of the vulnerabilities that we have identified in primarily violent cases have also been mentioned up here by some people who have managed to off-ramp for whatever reason. The first red flag is youth, or the first vulnerability is youth. I was saddened to hear the story from Ms. Onashuk earlier today on the Adam Woffen panel, where she described her brother beginning his radicalization process at 11 years old. The example I usually use is from actually an Adam Woffen sister group that was active in the Baltics, whose leader was arrested at 13 years old. The Buffalo shooter started radicalizing during COVID at 16. So this is the first big thing that is, again, a vulnerability to radicalization. The second important one that I think is identified in a lot of cases is mental illness. I'll again point to the Adam Woffen division case that Jessica Cran so eloquently put this morning. If you look at that case, the leader of the group and all three of the murderers that were part of that group all had autism spectrum disorder. That's a monumental conclusion. This is also a trend that we see very heavily in the incel movement, where we see high levels of autism, self-diagnosed autism spectrum disorder, also bullying. The third I'll point to is histories of being bullied. Again, a huge theme in the incel movement. Just generally people feeling isolated, a lack of belonging in their offline lives. The fourth is history of violence in the home, or significant childhood trauma. In 2019, there was a wave of 5 white supremacist terrorist attacks that hit the Western world: Christchurch, Poway, El Paso, Norway, and Germany. In 2 of those 5 cases, the perpetrator had a parent who committed suicide. And in one of the cases, it was actually the perpetrator who had discovered his father having committed suicide. Those 3 things in combination, mental health issues, a history of being bullied, and a history of violence in the home, I think those are the ones that really contribute to what some of the other panelists have said in terms of fear being a big factor, in terms of an inability to fit in being a big factor. I love what Mr. Kalik and Mr. Michaelis say about people hurting people. I think you really see it with those 3 elements. Substance abuse. another big vulnerability. Dylan Roof, for example, the Charleston gunman, was a prolific alcohol and drug user. Military experience, specifically combat experience. Less of a case in the youth group because obviously these individuals need to be a bit older, but obviously we frequently see post-traumatic stress disorder in these cases. And then the last one I'll mention, and it's probably the most important one, is a window of opportunity or a sense of urgency or access to firearms, all of which allow these people who have these vulnerabilities and who might be flirting with radical ideology or might be fully inside of radical ideology to exercise that grievance and go and commit an attack. Our challenge, and I think you're going to ask about this in a second, Catherine, is to figure out how we take all of those vulnerabilities and use them, right? What are the implications? Because one of the great lessons of the 9/11 years is you cannot target people based on a set of characteristics that you define, that you think emerge in these cases, and then go and look for them and think that you can kind of put them through a carceral approach or take them out of the system and that the problem's going to get better.
Can you expand on that a bit? How should we think about, and maybe even more importantly, act on red flags? There are a lot of kids suffering from mental health challenges, and certainly substance abuse is not uncommon among teenagers, and not all of them will go on to commit violence. So how do we act on these without stigmatizing the youth?
Sure. Let me take one step back quickly and explain why I have found when I talk about vulnerabilities in the counterterrorism space, why sometimes people get nervous. The first is people assume that if you're talking about mental health, you are trying to overlook ideology. So you're only talking about mental health because you don't want to have a much harder conversation about white supremacy. Two is people think you're only talking about mental health or other vulnerabilities because you want to distract from the gun question. Okay, you're only talking about mental health because you don't want to talk about gun control. Three is talking about vulnerabilities is disrespectful to victims because you're trying to compare the suffering of these families who have lost everything with the suffering that was endured by the people who took everything. And the fourth and most important is people say you should not talk about vulnerabilities because you're going to stigmatize the overwhelming majority of people with all of these vulnerabilities who never turn to extremism. And I want to be clear and say that these are all perfectly reasonable counterarguments. They need to be part of the conversation. The way that I think of this, Catherine, is I think the best thing we can do is think of these red flags, or whatever word you want to use, not as problems to fix, but as vulnerabilities to try to address. The key is that the solutions that we're trying to find are support-based, and again, I'll use that word again, not carceral. So we're trying to ensure that the work we're doing to address a young person who's isolated and dealing with autism spectrum disorder, let's say, is not being treated or sought out from a counterterrorism standpoint, but that we're bringing something to them that they need, that they're going to benefit from beyond the counterterrorism space, beyond counter-extremism. That also allows law enforcement to focus on the more serious cases, the ones where there is a true, clear mobilization to violence. So I think, let's think of these things as vulnerabilities, as things that show up frequently in the cases. Let's talk about them as important questions. But let's find solutions where people can bring help to these individuals where they really need it. That's why I'm so pleased to be sat next to Brette on this stage, who's designing precisely that program for the summit.
Great, thank you. I do have one more question for you, and I don't want you to steal Brette's thunder because I know she's going to partially answer this question, but I do some work on diversion programs, and I sometimes describe them as the tail wagging the dog, that the youth has to get arrested in order to get services that they should have had before they were arrested, but that they need to stay in this diversion program and complete the requirements in order to, not be filed or whatever the next step is. Do you have good examples of identifying youth based on these vulnerabilities and then connecting them to the services? And you can pass to Brette if you would like to.
I'll pass that to Brette, but I will say one thing. I'll just recall something from one of the stories this morning, again from Miss Onashuk, that really stuck with me, and that was, this is an individual. This was the Adamoffen case, the individual who was murdered by his roommate. This was a person who had protective factors in their life, and he was also a person who those protective factors, his family, his sister, saw what was happening and tried to intervene, and the intervention didn't work. And I think that's something that I'm going to take away from this and reflect on is like, okay, we can design the best guide of what the vulnerabilities are. We can have the best directory. The people have to want to engage. And what does it look like if they don't want to engage? And what do we do then? I think that's a really tough question. And I'm not quite sure what I can say except for just I'm going to have to reflect on that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I agree. Okay, let's move to you, Brette. And I doubt that you need an introduction, but I will tell the one person in the back of the room who doesn't know you that Brette serves as a Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, and she's also the founder of the Prevention Practitioners Network. And formerly, she established and served as Deputy Director of the U.S. Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, which coordinated all federal efforts to prevent violent extremism in the United States. And so I want to start, before we get in to the directory, which Jacob alluded to, I want to start by asking you, Brette, who usually notices these red flags, or who is in a good position to do so?
So often the people who are in the best position to recognize changes in behavior over time, because this is a behavior and vulnerability-based approach rather than a personal characteristic approach. But the people in the best position to recognize changes in behavior over time are your peers and your family. The people who spend the most time with you, who know you best, and can see those changes in behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so what is your role in providing information to those family members and peers who are seeing these red flags? Tell us about the directory.
Well, before I even get there, so the people who see those behavior changes over time, they often don't recognize what they're seeing, or even if they do recognize what they're seeing, they don't know where to go for help. And in research to date, often it's between 70 and 80% of people, depending on targeted violence, terrorism, and different studies, 70 to 80% of cases where someone has committed a violent act. Someone saw something ahead of time, most often those parents and peers. But more often than not, they never said anything to anyone. And a lot of the research has shown it's because they don't want to get someone they love in trouble. They're not confident in what they're seeing. They're not confident in the severity of the threat, whether to take those threats seriously. This is research by David Eisenman, Stephen Wine, and Michelle Grossman last year. And they really don't want someone they love to end up in jail, if it's at all avoidable. So we took 2 steps to address that. And I want to cue up the slide, please. All right. The first step we took was to launch the Screen Hate campaign, which we announced at Eradicate Hate this past year. As you can see on this slide, this was an effort to educate parents on those vulnerabilities that Jacob was mentioning, but not only that, what they could do, where they could go. So first, prepare, understand where youth are exposed to hate-fueled violence online. Second, talk Actually talk to the teens and young adults in your lives about what they're exposed to and how they're processing it. Third, prevent. Research has shown that before individuals are willing to seek help for someone they love, they want to do their own research. They want to understand what's really going on. And they want to talk to the youth directly and give them a chance to explain, contextualize, and talk through what they're seeing. So talk. And prevent gives those tools. It's a frequently asked questions style guide for parents who are trying to understand, trying to do that research, and trying to have those conversations. And then finally, and most importantly to this conversation, seek help. And when you click on Seek Help, you will be directed to Dave's app. And part of Dave's app, which is the next slide, please, is the Prevention Practitioners Network National Directory of interdisciplinary services, both resources and clinically licensed providers who have all raised their hand and said, we want to support youth who are in crisis and get them the supportive services they need, to Jacob's point, so that they don't turn to violence as the only solution to address their grievance.
Great. So how many resources are now available through the directory? What parts of the country do they represent?
So if you all clicked on the QR code that was on the last slide, I am hoping that number of resources is ticking up real time as you join that directory, because we want as many of you as possible. This is as inclusive of a process as it can be. We owe a lot of credit to Jones Day in helping us populate the directory over the last year. We're up to 187 resources and clinically licensed providers. Our dream is to get to at least one, if not multiple providers in every county across the country, so that no matter where you are, you can find services for a youth in crisis. When you recognize those vulnerabilities and you want to talk to someone, you can find those services to get them the support they need without fearing that your only option is potentially getting them in trouble or getting them incarcerated.
Mm-hmm. Great, and we're gonna get to the app in a second, but just staying on the directory itself for a minute, how do you get the word out to potential clinicians and other resource support organizations?
Right, so over the last year, I've lost track of how many professional associations we've reached out to. The Screen Hate campaign that I mentioned earlier, we've had over 1.7 million impressions. We partnered with Moonshot. They did a targeted advertising campaign, the first of its kind, targeting bystanders. So not targeting the people consuming extremist content themselves, but rather targeting the people whose search history suggests that they're looking for help. They're concerned about a teen in their life, and they want to get them the type of support that Jacob was describing. So one of the most common search terms was, what do I do if my kid is addicted to Roblox? But also searches like, what do I do if my son is denying the Holocaust? The types of searches that suggest they're concerned about someone's activity online and the risk of hate-fueled violence. And they're looking for the types of resources that this directory could provide. So targeted advertising. We also got the word out through influencers. So we worked with multiple different influencers through at least 10 different influencer posts to really drive deeper engagement with the Screen Hate campaign as well as with the directory. Because these influencers were saying, I had the conversation with my kid this night, and this is what I learned. This is why it was so important. And then you would see hundreds of comments in the chat of, I had this conversation too, or I'm having this conversation tonight. People actually demonstrating action. And that's really important because, as you know from evaluating programs, the call to action is only as valuable as the people who respond to that call and take that action. So that influencer campaign was to drive deeper engagement. Moonshot also piloted a Reddit campaign. And we were really pleased with the initial results of that pilot because they found in subreddits for teachers, for social workers, for parents, these concerned adults who may be coming across youth in crisis, the interest and the click-through rate was really positive. And then finally, what they found, Moonshot more broadly in all of their targeted advertising work, they did A/B testing for confidentiality and privacy. Because that fear of incarceration is strong, right? People want to know that when they're reaching out for supportive services, that they can have that confidential conversation with a trusted provider. Now, we all know a lot of those trusted providers are mandatory reporters. It's not that they won't report an imminent threat of physical violence to self or others, but they want to have that confidential conversation when it lies below that mandatory reporting threshold, to really understand when help might be needed and what types of supportive services might be most relevant, and then do that case management, do that coordinated care to get the youth they need. So that message of confidentiality was really important as well.
Yep, I can imagine. And I have other questions about funding and sustainability and the future of the directory, but I'm going to hold those and ask you if you have any plans for the directory apart from expanding the current model.
Yes. So with great thanks to the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships at DHS, we just next week will be launching a new initiative to develop a campaign for youth. So parents may be in the best position to see behavior change over time, but youth are often the ones who are most exposed to attack planning. Get some early indications that their friends may be thinking about bringing a weapon to school, for example, or other concerning behavior. And so in partnership with Community Matters, Riley Group, and Moonshot, over the next year, we will be developing programs in schools and online for youth, so that friends can help their friends get the help they need, in addition to the parents and concerned adults.
Great. That's wonderful. All right, I want to turn to Dave next and talk about this mysterious app. But first, let me tell you about Dave. So in the mid-2000s, he was a self-proclaimed couch potato, eating potato chips on a couch. And he, in solidarity with a friend, decided to take up running. And he worked his way up to a marathon in Boston in 2013. And as a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombings, he decided to do something different than his tech background. And so He went on to form the One World Strong Foundation, dedicated to improving the lives of those impacted by terrorist attacks, hate crimes, and traumatic events. He does, however, have that background in technology, and he's here to tell us about an app that he's created that is connected to the directory that Brette just described. So why don't you go ahead and Dave, and tell us about this app.
Thank you. So bringing me back to my couch potato days, the app itself was actually, where the roots of it are from the Boston Marathon. And I was injured that day just as I was about to finish. And as a survivor of an event, you have the ability to go to the court case and see what was happening. And part of what I saw, the older brother, I believe, was completely radicalized. I think the younger brother was coerced, kind of brainwashed into doing stupid things. Young, teenage at the time, and did some things that maybe there was a way, if friends, other students, family members, folks at the school, if people could have found a way to maybe interrupt the pattern, maybe something would have been different that day with the younger brother. But it made me think back then. My background is in process and network optimization, and when you see something that works, you try to expand that. You try to connect it to some other things. And one of the things that happened for us, we were visited in hospitals and rehab centers in Boston after the bombings by veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars with an organization called Semper Fi and America's Fund. To this day, we are still connected with those folks that came to help us deal with our trauma. And it was a lot of that connection that we saw and experienced firsthand that really led to forming an organization that worked with other survivors to help them move forward after trauma, without regard to race, religion, ethnic background, color, politics. Just none of that stuff matters. It's helping people move forward. But having that data that I had, or those data points that I had seen in court, and thinking, hey, there must be a way that we could maybe be involved on the prevention side. Through the State Department, I was involved in what's called the International Visitor Leadership Program, and I had a chance to go overseas through that program, and I saw Prevent in the UK. That made me interested into, okay, what are we doing in the US? Then the introduction to Homeland Security. And again, I come from wireless telecom, not government. I'm still learning my way through the nonprofit world. But what I saw was the mobile application itself that we're building allows people to connect on it in a safe environment, and talk a little bit about that in a minute. It was touched on a couple minutes ago, but the mobile app was born from survivors being able to help other survivors, but also by sharing their stories. And stories matter. You've heard that here this week. And sharing those stories, my story, somebody else's story, your story, that might connect with somebody to make them do something different. And when I learned about what was happening with the Prevention Practitioner Network and what that was in terms of bringing all these wonderful organizations together into one place, we had the ability, technically, to put that into a mobile application and make it easily, you can easily search, you can find, you can then utilize directly from the application organizations that are focused in this space and that know how to operate within this space. And I'm not from the prevention space, I'm not a practitioner, but when we see good things and we see things that work, like all of you, we want to give you a platform to be able to connect and find and work with folks that you can interrupt that pattern with and change that and help people. And as survivors of events, we don't want to have to go visit another community. We don't want to have to go to another school. We don't want to have to go to another building. It would be okay if we didn't have to do those things. So the role that we can help play on the prevention side, that really gave us that purpose, that feeling that we want to move forward and help. And being a part of the prevention space and being able to utilize the ability to, I'm guaranteeing folks are texting right now. You're looking at your phone, right? You have them with you. And the idea behind the app is that you've always got it with you. And it makes it easily accessible. And it's secure. And we can talk a little bit about the security piece if you're...
I am interested in that. Like, hearkening back to Jacob's discussion on not wanting to stigmatize youth, and then Brette's comments about family members being reluctant to find information if they think their search might be observed by somebody. So tell us about the experience of being on the app and how confidentiality is guaranteed.
So we built a mobile app. Obviously, I can't see everybody out there with the lights, but I'm gathering a lot of you use WhatsApp or maybe Signal. We built the mobile app to take no data. We don't want to track anything. We don't want to know where you're going or what you're doing. And we just want the information that resides on networks like what Brette has built and her team has built. We want to give you easy access to that so that you can find it, you can feel safe looking. Because I've been approached by folks that they were concerned about their teenager. But they were a little concerned about going to Google and saying that my son is into this crazy gaming stuff, and he's been saying, making anti-Semitic remarks. I'm hearing things I've never heard from him before, but if I go in and start searching for that creates algorithms. And you start to see some very strange things pop up on your feeds. And using the mobile app for this, it allows you to search without regard to what you're searching for. The different kinds of practitioners that Brette has on there, you can find, you can connect with there. We aren't a part of that. We're just a place to put them so that you can access them easily. And even when you access them, we don't know what you do with them next. But that was actually born from, we figured that out in Boston. After everything happened, lots of us we would talk together. We just talk about the healing process, and even a year or two later, people would say that they still couldn't sleep, or they were having difficulty sleeping, or that they were having nightmares. And they would type that into Google, and they would start to get back ads for pillows, mattresses, vacations, right? They're creating algorithms. We didn't want that. So the app takes nothing from you. So if you look on the App Store, either on the Google Play or on the Apple Store, if you look at the app itself, you'll see where it says what kind, you have to disclose what it takes. And we take nothing by design. So it's an easily accessible, safe place to be.
And does it have all of the 187 resources from the...
There are more today than there were yesterday.
And what is the name of the app?
So it's called Resilience Net, all one word.
Resilience Net. And you're in a room with like-minded people. We all clearly share a mission to eradicate hate. So how can we help both with the directory and with the app in terms of getting the word out or testing it or providing you with feedback? What can we do?
Feedback is fantastic. You guys can easily find who I am, and I'm happy to share it with you afterwards. But you also can do contact@oneworldstrong.org. We'll pick it up there, or you can contact me directly. The ability to connect with it and make comments on it, we would welcome that right now. But the big piece is to build out the practitioner network, state by state. And that's what's really going to make a difference, because as we move into version 2, what it'll start to look like, or what it would look like in version 2, is I'm sure everybody's familiar with Google Earth, and you've used Google Earth before, or even if you've used Airbnb. Yeah. So you can actually be able to pinch into the part of the country that you're looking for. You can pinch into your state, you can pinch into your city, and you can see the services that are available on the practitioner network. And you can actually then connect with them from there. And that's the goal of this, is to make it easy for people to connect to when somebody sees something that is we all hear this. We've talked about it over the last couple of days here, that when these things happen, people will always then come back and say, yeah, I think I noticed, or I saw this, or we want to give folks a safe place ahead of time to learn about this. And as we build out the practitioner network, we'll continue to advertise what it is, because we want parents, we want schools, we want people to utilize it as a tool to be a part of this.
So I'm going to make my plea one more time. Please join the directory. And just as importantly, as you come across really promising practices and innovative programs or excellent replications of evidence-based models, encourage them to join the directory as well. That it takes all of us to build this out. So we've done outreach with the American Psychological Association, outreach with the National Association of School Counselors, the National Association of School Administrators, the National Association of Social Workers, the National Association of Forensic Social Workers. Like, it becomes an alphabet soup. But we need all of your help to build this out as the inclusive resource that anyone who sees a youth in trouble can turn to get them the support they need.
And I just have to say thank you to CP3 and Homeland for the grants that you've allowed us to do this with. We would not be here without this and without. We're all building something new. And this doesn't exist, or it exists now, but we want it to be much bigger. And we're excited to build it with all of you and all of those folks that you know. I've been here now 3 years in a row. I remember coming here the first year. I think we had 2 people to a table, and masks on. And to see everybody here and to be interacting in the lobby and in the sides, I've never met a more focused group of people that want to make change. And it's exciting to be a part of what this is and how it's being built. And then just a huge thanks to the entire Eradicate Hate team. What you're doing here in Pittsburgh, by bringing people together, not only here in the US, but globally, makes a huge difference. Thank you.
I concur, and thank you, Laura, for all of the work you've done, and thank you everybody in the room for being here. And please join me in thanking this tremendous panel.